Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Finally, we are at the end of chapter 5. This is going to be the last video for this chapter, Asymmetrical Synthesis of the Sensible. And all we're going to be doing is finishing up psychic systems, which we started in the last video. And to do that, we have to address two things, death and the other. So the first part of the video is death. Now here Deleuze talks about there being two faces of death in a psychic system. And the first of them is the cancellation of difference in an explicated system. So if you remember at the beginning of the last video, we talked about cancellation of difference in physical systems and biological systems. In a physical system, it was physical equilibrium. In a biological system, it was just death when the organism dies. And we're talking about actual death here. But for a biological organism, it's just a biological system. It's just death. It's just the end of difference. There's no more potential, and that's the end of it. For a psychic system, we're still talking about physical death here in the first phase, but instead of it just being the termination of life, something else is lost, something else is cancelled, is annihilated in this first phase of death. So it's the same as death in biological systems, or it corresponds to death in biological systems, because the psychic system is also a biological system. But it has this added element of the I and the self, which have been differentiated. And so with the cancellation of difference in a psychic system, we have death, but the death of not just biology, the death of not just the death of something alive, but the death of an I and a self. So the I and the self in psychic, and the death of a psychic system are dissolved. And that's the difference. Deleuze calls this a de-differentiation, rendering the differentiations which produce the I and the self uniform. And this connects back to entropy, because the differences, the differentiation with a C that was explicated in the psychic system and in the form of an I and a self has now been annihilated. That the difference has been cancelled, and it's back to a uniform state of no potential, no potentiality. And it's essentially physical death, but it's physical death with this added element of the I and the self that were that died. So that's the first phase anyway, the cancellation of difference in an explicated system. The second phase is the death instinct. And this goes a little bit further, because there is no correlate for this in a biological system. Before we look at what the death instinct is, however, it's worth noting that we have talked about this before, the death instinct, and we did it way back in video 8 when we were talking about the third synthesis of time, Thanatos. And there we described the death instinct as time empty and out of joint. So this was the third synthesis of time. Time was formal and static order. We described it as the crushing unity and irreversible series. And that made up the death instinct. The death instinct we're going to talk about today is completely different from that. And at first I thought this was just, one of those rare moments in difference and repetition where two ideas don't quite align. Maybe Deleuze forgot about the first one or didn't think about connecting them or whatever. And then just before I recorded this video, just before I started recording, I realized that that first death instinct is, and all of the syntheses of time are related to repetition. And the death instinct we're talking about now in the second part of the book is related to difference. So the repetition in those syntheses of time, as opposed to difference and the ideas, individuation, explication, differentiation, differentiation, all of those concepts are quite separate. And so when we're talking about the death instinct now, we're talking about the death instinct as it relates to difference. Whereas before, when we were talking about Thanatos, that was the death instinct as it related to repetition. So I think there is a clear distinction between those two, and that is important to note. And that's probably important to note in other places as well, but I didn't realize it until just today. So there it is. So what is the death instinct in relation to difference then? I'll give you a quote. The death instinct is an internal power which frees the individuating elements from the form of the I or the matter of the self in which they are imprisoned. The liberation and swarming of little differences in intensity. A matter of individuation. A protest by the individual which has never recognized itself within the limits of the self and the I. So the death instinct is an internal power freeing the individuating elements from the form of the I or the matter of the self. Some important things to note in there. The form of the I, the matter of the self, that is the differentiated, the explicated, the actualized organism. We also talked about it as the I being the species and the self being the organism itself. Here Deleuze is using another way that he described these, the I as the form and the self as the matter. So the death instinct is freeing the individuating elements from that crystallization that they have undergone, that process by which they have explicated as fixed, definite things. And then we're going back then to the individuating elements. So back to the process of individuation, to the individual, which is prior to the I and the self, which is in fact a fractured I and a dissolved self. And that's basically the idea with this death instinct. It's a dissolving of the differentiated I and the self, as the first phase of death was as well. But this time, instead of cancelling potentiality along with the cancellation of difference, we're moving back to differences in intensity, i.e. individuation, back to the dissolved self and the fractured I, back to possibility, freedom, creativity, potentiality, back to something else can arise from this. Another idea can be explicated here. And so that's the second phase of death. Deleuze also connects these two phases of death with Freud, and he talks about Freud's suggestion that the organism wants to die, but to die in its own way, so that real death always presents itself as a foreshortening, as possessing an accidental, violent, and external character, which is anathema to the internal will to die. So there, death as foreshortening, accidental, violent, and external, that's an empirical death. That's the first phase of death, where there's no more possibility, no more potentiality. But the second phase of death is this internal will to die, where the organism dies in its own way. And dying in its own way means that there's a recovery of difference. Something new can be born from this death. And in contrast to the empirical, Deleuze calls this transcendental death. And I would also just mention before we leave death that in video 8 we talked about death as personal and impersonal. And this does correspond to the death that we're talking about here. Corresponding to the first phase of death, the cancellation of difference. In video 8, personal death was the annihilation of the difference represented by the I or the ego. And the second phase of death, the death instinct, this corresponded to the impersonal death we talked about back then, which was the state of free differences when they're no longer subject to the form imposed upon them by an I or an ego. So there is a direct correlation to the death that we talked about in Thanatos when we were dealing with repetition. But the death instinct itself gets a different expression. Deleuze doesn't call that, he doesn't call impersonal death the death instinct there. Death instinct is associated with time, empty and out of joint. So anyway, those are just some of the connecting threads that I think are important to be aware of. And that means we are into the second part of the video, which is the other. So within psychic systems, we have what Deleuze calls centers of envelopment, in which individuating factors are being explicated. So this is to do with the individual. These centers arise within the I-self system, i.e. the individual, i.e. not by the I or the self on their own, because the I and the self haven't been explicated yet. They don't even exist. All there is the fractured I and the dissolved self. And so in the individual, and this is kind of important to be aware of as well, in the individual, the self as dissolved is what is expressed, i.e. more ideas, virtual multiplicities. And the I as fractured is the expressive character of the individual. And this is a movement of multiplicity. So again, there's nothing crystallized within the individual here when we talk about the I and the self. Hence, the fractured I, the dissolved self. The movement of multiplicity, the expressive character of the I, and the virtual multiplicities themselves, what is expressed, which is the self. So because these centers of envelopment don't belong to an I or a self, which only emerge in differentiated species or organisms, form or matter, those are the different ways we talked about it, this is exactly what Deleuze calls the other. Because these centers of envelopment don't attach to an I or a self, they are then, for Deleuze, the other. And he gives an example here of looking at a terrified face which expresses a possible world. So the terrified face, he says, does not resemble what terrifies it. It envelops the state of the terrifying world. So for the face, the world is the other. The face, however, expresses a possible world, one that is, in this case, terrifying. And it does this by enveloping a state of the world, a terrifying state, thereby expressing the world, which is the expressed, in a way that doesn't resemble it. because the terrified face doesn't actually resemble the terrifying world. It's a completely different state. It's a completely different system. It's a completely different thing. It represents it. It represents not the right word. It expresses it, but it expresses it in a way that's completely different from the thing that it's expressing. And we can take that parallel, we can take that idea and apply it directly to psychic systems. So it's the same thing here. For psychic systems, we have a swarm of possibilities, but because the swarm of possibilities don't belong to an I or a self, they are other, then individuation expresses these possibilities by enveloping them, and in turn being enveloped by them, thereby expressing them in a way that doesn't resemble them. So the other then is incorporated into the psychic system as something which can be expressed and then differentiated, actualized. So the other is a crucial part of this whole process for Deleuze. Ideas, individuation, explication. It's a crucial part of anything being actualized. And this is a really novel take on the other. As far as I'm aware, anyway. I've never heard of anything like this, but it's even more radical than Levinas's other, which was a radical departure from the other of people like Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. But anyway, the main idea here is that the other is the expression of a possible world. And that's the key point, I think. The other as expression of a possible world. So it's expressed through individuation in such a way that the possible is enveloped, meaning that what is expressed is different. It doesn't resemble the swarm of possibilities itself. That's back to this idea of pure creativity, pure creation. And yeah, a really interesting idea there. And it is worth thinking about how this, it is worth comparing this with other theories, because it is such a radical departure. So if the other is the expression of a possible world, I really like that phrase too, the expression of a possible world, then, as I said, this is radically different from other theories. But the important point for Deleuze is that other theories have then failed to grasp the fundamental nature of the other, the fundamental structure of the other, because they have all treated it as an object for a subject. They've adopted this subject-object dichotomy, where the subject is the I and the other is any object in relation to it. And that structure is already external. It's already too late, if you like. It's missed something more fundamental, which is what Deleuze has latched onto here. And so he says the problem, trying to capture the problem with other theories of the other, for it is not the other which is another I, but the I which is an other, a fractured I. So a fundamental reorientation. It's not the other which is another I, but the I which is already an other. It's a fractured I. And we can boil this down to other theories having approached and understood the other from the perspective of the I. I am here, and that object for me is therefore an other. So they start with the I. But Deleuze, like I said, is going back before there is an I. And he's discovering there is already an other there at the beginning. So he's understanding it from the perspective of the whole out of which the I arises, the virtual multiplicity, back to this idea of ideas and individuation. Prior to this explication of the I and the self, there is an other there already, and it is a fractured I. And that is a fundamental reorientation, a fundamental departure, a radical departure from other theories of the other. And that's interesting. That's really a really unique idea, I think. And that is the end of the video. That's everything I wanted to cover. It's a much shorter video than normal, but it's just the way the cookie crumbles. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, we talked about death. There were two faces of death in a psychic system. The first was the cancellation of difference, and this was we connected this with entropy. This is basically physical death. It's the end of the organism, of the psychic system, but it's not the same as biological death, because a psychic system includes this I and the self. The second phase of death was the death instinct, and this was also a dissolving of the differentiated I and the self, but this time it involved a return to the intensive individual. So potentiality was recovered, and something new could emerge from this death. And in the second part, we looked at the other. And so the other, within a psychic system, the other is the centers of development in which individuating factors are explicated. And this was other because at this stage there is no I or self. All we have are the fractured I and the dissolved self. So Deleuze is finding an other prior to the emergence of a subject. And this gave us a general structure of the other, which is the expression of a possible world. This was a really nice way to think about it, a radical revision of different theories of the other, which all start with a subject and oppose an object to it. But this notion moved back from that. Prior to there being a subject, there was already an other, a fractured I, at the beginning of this process, in the individuating process. And the general structure of the other then is the expression of a possible world, which also applies to other people. If you think about what another person is, they are also the expression of a possible world, a different world. They are a different perspective on the world, the realization of a different way of being, of a completely different explication. And this really ties in nicely with Deleuze's metaphysics, I think. And that's us. So yeah, we're done. Chapter 5. So the last part of the book is the conclusion, and it's a really thorough conclusion. And basically all he does is summarize everything that's come before, which means it's really good to read if you've already read the rest of the book, because it's a nice way to solidify some ideas and just go over them again. But it's kind of like I've already done the conclusion with this video series. That's what it is. I'm summarizing his work page by page, and that's basically what the conclusion does. It's a summary of his work page by page almost. So I was hesitant about whether to even do a couple of videos on this, but I think I will, just for the sake of completeness. So I'm going to the next couple of videos, and I hope there will only be 2. I want to go through the conclusion quite quickly. Like I say, it is just a summary of everything that we've talked about. So my videos of the conclusion will be a summary of his summary of his own work. So I'll try and keep that as brief as possible, but I think, yeah, it feels a bit incomplete if I leave it here without making a couple of videos on this. So that's where we are. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped, and I'll see you in the next one.